All the candidates have been selected for the Gorton and Denton by-election. We'll be previewing what the final outcome of that particular contest may be. We'll also be looking at the fallout from the Epstein files and Keir Starmer's trip to China, whilst telling you all about our latest visit to Parliament and our hospitality and visitor economy campaign. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yes, welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast. With me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. And, one of us picked up a point over the weekend as far as the football was concerned. Plymouth are struggling once again, a 2-1 defeat. And West Ham, what happened there? 2-0 up at Chelsea, and they threw it away to get beat 3-2, and relegation looms. But enough of the footy. There's been lots happening in the world of politics, as ever, of course, and we're going to start our conversation this week with that by-election in Gorton and Denton. We spoke last week about Andy Burnham being blocked from being Labour's candidate. James suggested that Jonathan Ashworth may make a comeback, but of course, as was inevitably the case and predicted by yours truly, it is a female candidate that Labour has selected. The Reform candidate, Matt Goodwin, an interesting character. We might get into our thoughts about him. And then, of course, Zach Polanski, who is not, let us remind ourselves, the Green Party leader, a member of Parliament at the moment, declined to stand in the seat. Obviously not that confident of the Greens winning. And then the other thing that we should talk about as far as this by-election is concerned is why the Liberal Democrats not being considered a serious contender in the Manchester seat. So, Jim, I'll start with you. You know a little bit about the Labour candidate, I believe.
Yes, I did the hustings in the Cheshire South seat at the last general election when Andrea Brandreth was the Conservative candidate and Angelika Stoja was the Labour candidate. And her question came up about what are you going to do for small towns? And Angelika said, well, that's not an issue here, which the people of Sandbach and Tarpley didn't relish very much. I have to say she didn't over-impress me, but she is the candidate now and has a huge weight of responsibility. It's obviously going to be very interesting. Andy Burnham has obviously pledged to campaign in the constituency, and it will be important for any longer-term political aspirations that he has, that he does his duty. But of course, when he comes into the constituency, what will already be a feverish circus will just turn into a bit like when Boris Johnson came to apologise in Liverpool, a story I covered in the early noughties, an absolute pantomime. But that's the situation we have. I mean, Matt Goodwin, I think we all have reservations about, and Joe will talk more eloquently about this because, of course, he's a presenter on GB News. But I sort of followed him from being an interesting academic to having more and more extreme views. And then, of course, we've got the Green candidate, who's Hannah Spencer and not Polanski, although Polanski was on television yesterday and, he is strikingly self-confident, and it was quite breathtaking in one respect, because he was talked for quite a long time about the legalization of drugs and saying it's a health problem, we'll have to deal with it in another way. But I just think that at the moment, my money is, putting my head on the block once again, as I do every week for your pleasure, Frank. I just think the Greens could actually do it. If the early polls show the Greens out in front, I think there'd be a lot of consolidation around that. I had deep misgivings about the way they've emphasised Gaza rather than trees in this campaign, but I think in this particular circumstances, that's probably tactically right. But it's an absolutely fascinating by-election. It's got everything that we political anoraks love.
Joe, tell us about Matt Goodwin.
I'm a fairly, broad-minded, fine, take people as they come, but he's one of the most obnoxious people I've ever met, and I've actually refused to go on GB News with him, having been on a couple of times. He's very, very rude. He's very, very arrogant. I find his views, his political views, absolutely abhorrent, but that is not the reason. It's the way he is to people, production staff, security staff, that sort of thing. And I think you can tell a lot about people about the way they treat the minions, if you like. He's a man with very thin skin. He's got an overinflated sense of his own importance. And the silly thing is, I mean, as has been well documented over quite a lot of articles, not least of all by his one-time collaborative writing partner, Matt Ford, that actually there was a time when Matt Goodwin was a really interesting thinker, and he was writing and examining stuff about the right wing and the sort of anti-Islamic rhetoric that was beginning to, and he was widely respected, and he was put on a social mobility panel or something like that. He became a professor at the age of 34, which is very young, and then all of a sudden left the University of Kent at Canterbury, according to reports, due of a voluntary severance. He's a strange one, and he's a very strange choice, I think, for reform, because while people might like the rhetoric of Nigel Farage and the anti-immigration and all the rest of it, I think that Matt Goodwin could come a cropper, a little bit like Liz Truss did when she did all those local radio interviews, by treating people as though they are lesser beings. And I think it'll only take one smart local radio or local paper interviewer or an encounter on a doorstep, and you'll see his true colours. And I think I don't think he's going to appeal. We have to wait and see. People might look beyond him and just think we want reform, but he's a very odd choice, and it's a very high gamble, I think, for Farage. And don't forget, the other thing is that he's got the endorsement of Tommy Robinson, which I think tells you an awful lot you need to know about his political views.
Yeah, it did seem to me to be a strange choice, because he's way out to the right, even in reform terms. So you do wonder about Nigel Farage's political antennae as far as that's concerned. And of course, he's made some rather unfortunate remarks about Manchester itself on social media, which will go down like a cup of cold sick, I'm sure, in Gorton and Denton. That being said, we, of course, are very aware and conscious of who these candidates are, but the vast majority of those who are going to be asked to go to the polls in February, probably not that likely to either be aware of these candidates and their backgrounds, or indeed take much notice of the coverage. We can only hope that in days gone by, you could forget the Peter Tatchell by-election, for example, in Bermondsey. But these days, they don't seem to attract that much attention. And whether or not, as I say, the electorate take that much notice anyway, I think that Reform's vote will be Reform's vote. And as Jim said, it might turn out to be a case of the progressive voters within the constituency being asked to hold their nose and vote for the most likely winner. The most likely winner apparently is going to be between the Green Party and the Labour Party. And that brings me on to the question, James. Who is the Liberal Democrat candidate, and why are they not being talked about as a serious alternative as far as this constituency is concerned?
The Liberal Democrat candidate is a very good friend of mine. She's Jackie Pearcey. She's a long-standing figure in Liberal Democrat politics in the city of Manchester, been a councillor, and rode the wave of when the Liberals really came forward in the early noughties in the urban areas. Obviously, Liverpool was the one where they actually got power. but they were very strong. If Professor John Tong was with us, he would tell you how mortified he was when I said, "Come on, John, give me a line and say that the Liberal Democrats are going to remove Labour from overall control in Manchester." And that was in about 2005. And he gave me the line. And of course, Labour won fairly convincingly. But the fact that I was even posing that shows the strength of the Liberal Democrats. And we have to remember John Leach was the Liberal Democrat MP for Withington for a long time, defeated Lucy Powell as late as 2010. So they on the flanks of this constituency, and indeed within it, there's a guy, another leading Liberal Democrat, Keith Whitmore, big figure in the 11th Hume Longside area. You know, the Lib Dems were there, but as you've hinted, this is the problem for the Lib Dems. In a sense, the Greens have slightly replaced them. Just one last word on reform. They do have two major obstacles apart from the personality of the candidate. Just generally speaking, their strength is in Denton, which is a much more white working class area, but it's much smaller in terms of the population that's going to be in this by-election than the Manchester wards, which has a very high proportion of Asian people and a lot of university, either postgraduates or students. And I would have thought that for both those communities, reform is anathema. So there is a numbers game here, and that's what's cooled me on the idea of a reform victory.
You've done a very good political job there, Jim, in not answering the question I posed and giving us a history lesson of how strong the Liberal Democrats used to be in Manchester. And that actually makes the case for me. They have totally failed to break through in the north of England, certainly in the northwest. And this should be the sort of by-election where the Lib Dems and Ed Davey are saying, we're going to go for this. In fact, it's more likely that they'll have a quiet campaign on the basis that they have virtually zero chance of winning and therefore would prefer Labour or the Greens to win. The fact that the Green Party, with, I have to say, a rather bizarre set of policies, if you listen to Zach Balansky's speeches over the last few weeks, they've moved away from the environmental agenda that took them, you could argue, to where they are. They're moving more into radical economics. He's talking, as we were saying off air, Jim, on the BBC over the weekend about his plans to legalise drugs. But the Liberal Democrats are just not breaking through. Why is that, Jim? Because as far as you're concerned, people like Andy Street and Ruth Davidson should be seeing the Liberal Democrats as an alternative home. Why would any serious politician who's interested in real power join the Liberal Democrats, who are nowhere to be seen in this crucial by-election in Manchester?
Yeah, well, I don't want to be guilty of going back into history, but of course, urban liberal democracy sort of reached its zenith to some extent in 2010. But because they went into that coalition deal and because they broke their promise on student fees, that did them massive damage in Manchester, and they're
still not recovered.
Yeah, and they've not recovered, and that's the answer. And it's, in a sense, there was then a vacuum into which the Greens have filled. And as we said last week, the problem the Lib Dems have got nowadays is that they used to be, the only alternative for people who are fed up with the Tories and Labour. But now people have got a menu of choices, and the Greens being one of them in this particular seat.
I think that's right, because I mean, if you think back to, without going back into the realms of history, but because I can't outdo Jim on that, but when you think of the sort of the famous Lib Dem by-election victories like Beaconsfield and Christchurch, and places like that, those days have gone because, as you say, I mean, politics is so fractured. And I think, what you've got with the Green Party is a left-wing populist against the right-wing populism of reform. And it may well be that when it comes to the vote on the 26th, people will quietly say it's about keeping reform out, even if that means holding your nose, and if you're a Lib Dem voter, don't vote Labour or vote Green or something. I mean, the problem is that the left has got more chance of its vote being fractured. The than the right have, because, but are we going to see Suella Braverman and, Robert Jenrick? Are they going to be up there campaigning for reform? Because that would be hilarious.
Labour will hope so, and so will the Greens. I think the other thing that, I'm sort of trying to tease Jim a little as far as the Liberal Democrats are concerned, but we've got, again, remind our listeners, we've got a safe Labour constituency here. Now, okay, it's 18, 19 months into the Labour government, but they should not be in the trouble that they are and on the verge of potentially losing a safe seat. And also have to say, we keep talking about this. I'm getting tired of listening to myself saying communication. When they decided to block Burnham, some bright spark at number 10 decided to say to the press, and of course, we're inevitably going to lose the seat now.
Yeah.
What does that do? It immediately says to those voters in Gorton, we best vote Green if we don't want reform, because Labour are already saying they've got no chance. What a ridiculous tactic to use. Talk about, okay, we all understand and appreciate the management of expectations, but what a stupid comment to make before Labour has even selected their candidate. Jim, they are just hopeless at this stuff, aren't they?
Well, let's be generous and say they overthink these things, and they're trying to sort of defer the shock of a Labour defeat in advance by anticipating it, and then it won't. Then they can ride on to the local elections and hope to do better. But that's all too clever by half. Can we just have a word about Hannah Spencer, because it is she who is carrying the Green banner here. She's the leader of the Green group on Trafford Council. I know nothing about her, but she's gonna, as is the case in politics so often, some complete unknown suddenly has the burden of history on their shoulders. So we'll see whether she goes along with Zach Polanski's radical proposals. I would have thought to go on.
She's very local. She's a plumber. She's as you say, she's a councillor, leader of the Green group on the local council. I think she looks like, on paper, she looks like a really good pick, and far better than having. Zach Polanski ruled himself out, for reasons that he said, because he's a Jewish and he's gay, and I think that's fair enough. And anyway, it's usually preferable to have a local candidate. But she knows local politics, she knows the area. She's working class, and she's doing a proper job as a plumber. She's not a sort of an airy-fairy political advisor.
And she apparently stood against Andy for the mayoralty in Greater Manchester in 24.
It won't matter who the candidates are, I would suggest. I think most people will go to the polls not knowing and just voting for the party, which is why, as I say, Labour's initial statement on this by-election, I think, was daft, and has opened up the prospect, I think, more likely for the Greens to become victors. Interesting your analysis, Jim, in terms of reform, this not necessarily being the safest sort of seat for them to fight. You do wonder whether that was running through Nigel Farage's head when he decided to let Goodwin run for it. And he thought, well, let the little bastard have a go for this. He's not going to win it anyway. But that maybe a bit too conspiratorial. But I've met Matt Goodwin myself, and although I certainly don't know either of them as well, either Farage or Goodwin as well as you do, Joe, I can imagine myself having a pint with Nigel Farage. I can imagine myself having a fight with Matt Goodwin.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there you go. We will keep our eye on what happens over the next few weeks as that by-election unfolds. But as Jim said, it is fascinating for political anoraks. For the wider public, I think it'll just be a pimple on the bum of a lot of things that are happening. And we're going to turn our attention to some of those after this short break.
Hi, I'm Stephen Hesketh, CEO of Savvy Hotels, owner of the Hospitality Hero and co-owner of DivaFest. And I'm here today to share with you our great event that's coming up in collaboration with Downtown in Business, which is the Great Art of Hospitality Conference, happening on the 26th of February in Manchester City Centre at the Treehouse Hotel. This event will bring the creme de la creme of hospitality all in one room. We're looking at 200 individuals coming together to listen to the great operators in hospitality, but likewise some political big hitters to also question them on all things hospitality. We can't wait to see you there.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den. Me, Frank McKenna, here with Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. And let's turn our attention to the international arena. Our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has been leading a delegation of business leaders and other institutions from the UK to China this week. And of course, as you would anticipate, some in the right-wing media have been very critical of our Prime Minister's efforts. Beth Rigby from Sky introduced her first piece on this important international visit as "Never Hear Keir in China." What an absolutely disgraceful way to talk about a Prime Minister. But there you go. It seems to be the way in which some of our journalists believe you ought to be able to talk about people in government these days. And we wonder why people don't want to go into politics anymore. Anyway, that aside, my take on this is that it's been a successful visit. He's won one or two important concessions from the Chinese. He's also signalled, I think, to the United States that they are not the partner that they once were, and therefore it is important for the United Kingdom, as Mark Carney suggested as far as Canada was concerned, to keep lines of communication open. Of course, the big news from where I am sat, which of course is in the fabulous city of Liverpool, is that a new car manufacturing plant for electric vehicles, Chery, will be established here, creating much needed high quality jobs. And Liam Robinson, who is on that delegation with Keir Starmer, obviously absolutely delighted with that result. It has, as I say, been met with some criticism as the visit from Starmer to China by the right-wing media in this country, by some Conservatives who appear to forget that it was David Cameron and George Osborne who started this closer relationship with China and sold half the country off to them. But never let history get in the way of a good story. And Donald Trump's reaction was interesting as well. He said Britain needed to be careful about its relationship with the Chinese. Maybe Mr. Trump needs to look in the mirror then and start to consider some of the statements he's made and some of the threats he's made to the UK and our European allies, and of course to Canada. So, Joe, what did you make of this? Am I being a little too relaxed about this cozying up to the Chinese?
No, and I think, your attitude is as a businessman, Frank, and I think that is the point. Everybody can get agitated and hot under the collar and say, well, we shouldn't be talking to China, we shouldn't be talking to China, they're all evil, they're baddies. Business needs those sort of relationships, and for every single one of those people, including Ian Duncan Smith and Kemi Badenoch and all the others who say, oh, we mustn't do anything, I would ask them to turn over whatever it is, whether it's their phone, a piece of kit on their laptop, something in their car, their washing machine, their clothes even. Where's it made? I don't think Keir Starmer went out there selling off the family silver, which there isn't any left anyway, because as you said, Cameron and Osborne did that pretty comprehensively. And also, Keir Starmer has gone to China after Mark Carney. Trump himself is going to China in a few weeks, if he can remember where China is. China. So it's not like, it's only Britain. Lots of people are talking, as they are to India as well. And in the current political state of the world, you've got to keep those lines of communication, as you say, Frank, open with everybody, apart from Russia, obviously. And actually, Trump, if he wasn't so mercurial, so threatening, and such an absolutely unpredictable bully, people probably wouldn't be so keen to talk to China and India. But I think it's daft to pretend we don't do business with them. I think it doesn't mean to say that we give in to everything, and I think there are concerns about the Chinese embassy in London, but you have to remember who started the negotiations on that. One Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary. So, there's a whole load of things going on. I think, you go in, it's like any negotiation or any talks that you have, you go in pretty open-minded, but you're sensible and careful. I would be more interested to know what the business people who went with Starmer thought of it, whether they thought it was a waste of time or whether they feel that there's something coming out of it.
I think that reports from the business leaders who were there and from business generally is positive. And there was an announcement on visas. So it's going to make it a lot easier to do trade with China and get in and out of the country, which was good news, obviously, from a business perspective. As I say, the announcement on the new car plant in Liverpool was made. I'm sure there are announcements from other regions that I've not picked up. But I think what it does tell you, Jim, is that in this time of fervent geopolitical turbulence, we are in a situation, as little old Blighty, cut off as we are from our European neighbours as well, that we've got to talk to everyone as far as trade is concerned. I would probably argue, though, that even when the world is relatively at peace with itself, it would be silly for us to cut ourselves off from a trade and business perspective from one of the bigger economies on the planet.
Yes, I'll ultimately come down on that side. I'll just say one word. An awful lot happened after the golden era of David Cameron. We had the spying, we had the treatment of people in Hong Kong, where China flagrantly tore up the arrangement that it had made with us in 1997. There's that whole anxiety about how much control they've got over our infrastructure. There was still big questions to be asked about how COVID originated. And the Uyghur people and all that. So a lot happened to cause the freeze, which is now being unfrozen. But you are right in that sense, and I'm quite intrigued by you mentioning this cherry car plant, because the cynical media were snidely making references it was only visas and whiskey. But you've raised a substantial point there. But this is not just a vague idea. This plant is going to be built on Merseyside, is it?
Yeah.
Well, that should have been reported.
No coverage.
No coverage at all.
Really? Obviously, I'm aware of it because I've actually texted Liam Robinson to congratulate him, and Steve Rotherham's been on social media welcoming the news as well. It's as I say, it's high quality jobs in an area where they're needed. So I think that. Yeah, maybe again it comes back to communications. Perhaps we need to be pushing that story out more, and there may be other things happening in other regions that we're not aware of. But the fact is, it was a big business delegation that went across. It wasn't simply the Prime Minister going to glad hand with dignitaries from China and Xi Jinping. It was a serious trade visit, and as I say, that deal has been done.
Yes, and also he then went on to Japan, which is important because, at the moment, Japan-Chinese relations are pretty poor because the current Japanese Prime Minister, who's standing for election actually this week, I think, has been unusually robust in saying that Japan would sort of somehow get involved in defending Taiwan, which really annoyed the Chinese. So Keir Starmer is playing a sort of probably the right game, in saying, we'll deal with China, but we're going to support our allies in Asia as well. And, we're going to, because the United States is behaving so erratically, we're going to follow the Carney doctrine of actually trying to do deals with other countries. The other week we had this, you encouraged me to this fantasy of it being sort of Russia and the United States versus China, Canada and Europe. I'm not saying we're going down that road, but Starmer's doing this. I mean, it's the old argument as we have with the Saudis, and who have an appalling civil rights record, and yet we sell them military arms. It's dealing with the devil with a spoon. Now, I'd like to know Zach Belansky's idealism in all this respect. What's his view? Is he, because of the appalling civil rights record of of Russia or well, not Russia, but China and Saudi Arabia. We should have nothing to do with them. It's a difficult, complicated world, and I think, given the erratic behavior of the United States, it's probably right to say to Mr. Trump, we have got other options.
Zach Polanski's view is we should be all basically growing potatoes, leeks and cannabis in the back garden and cracking on ourselves. We don't need trade with anyone else. We'll be self-sufficient. It'll be the good life, Jim.
Well, it would be a good idea if we did make more.
I'm not talking about Zach Polanski. He's never going to be
just
Prime
saying
Minister.
we should make more things here. It's all China. We ought to make more stuff here.
Well, it's fine to say that, Jim. It's a great notion and it's magnificent, apart from the fact that we live in the fucking real world. And therefore, you have to accept that unless the Brits are prepared to give up their cheap clothing from China, their cheap electronic goods from China, the 1,000,001 other things that we get at far less cost because they are produced, whether it be China, India, or elsewhere in the world, then unfortunately, we are in the place that we are in, and there is no putting the genie back in the bottle. It is for the birds to think that we are ever going to have a strong manufacturing base in this country in the way that we did back in the day when you were covering Parliament, James. It's just not going to happen. And, if you want to gain history lessons, we decimated our manufacturing base when Thatcher was Prime Minister. And it's never going to be able to recover from them. And Thatcher, of course, came up with the idea of the single market, which we would support, but it inevitably led to where we are now, which is the UK, basically speaking, being the place where we deliver great services, but we're never going to be able to have that great made in Britain manufacturing foundation and base to our economy again. If you think we can, then fucking good luck to you. Go and join Zach Polanski, because you're about as realistic as he is in terms of his view of the world. Let me just say one final thing as well in terms of human rights. This has always been a concern with the Chinese. I remember when I was first elected to the county council in 1989, Louise Almond had just been on a trip to China with all sorts of ideas and initiatives planned. And it was, of course, those famous protests. Do you remember the photograph of the tank and the young Chinese guy stood in front of the tank? And all of a sudden, all of those negotiations and plans unraveled. And it was 97, 98 before I was then able to actually return to China and start to do some business again with them. So it has always been an issue. It's always been something that has exercised the political views of administrations for decades now. But I think the point you make, Jim, Saudi, look how much business we do with them. I think, though, increasingly what you've got to say is the United States of America. I mean, are we seriously saying that they will pass any sort of smell test as far as human rights are concerned?
Absolutely.
2 basic bloody assassinations of innocent American people and some awful cases around immigration and the way they're just snatching people, including 5-year-old kids, by the way, taking them hundreds of miles away from their homes. And even a judge was brave enough this week to say it's scandalous what the government are up to. It was over that case of the 5-year-old boy and his dad who got shipped off illegally by ICE, as it turns out. They've now been released, thankfully. But, Donald Trump is in no way, shape or form able to stand on any platform and preach about human rights at this moment in time.
No, or the rights of rights of freedom of speech or anything. I mean, it's been announced today that the Kennedy Center, which he wants to rename the Kennedy Trump Center, is closing for 2 years. He's announced that. Trump's announced that. That's off the back of a whole load of very high profile musicians and artists saying we're not going to perform there if it's going to become the Trump Center. This closing down of any dissent is absolutely what happens in China. It's what happens in Russia. It happens in parts of the Middle East. And you're absolutely right. We should stop pretending that America can be held up as it once was as a defender of, you know, freedom and ambition and aspiration, because it's, you know, it takes something for a Republican president to get the backs up of the National Rifle Association, you know, and he's managed to do that, which, you know, even by Keir Starmer's comms standards, is doing something pretty awful.
Well, they also lost a seat in Texas this
Yeah.
week, did the Republicans, for the first time since 1991. So he'll be keeping his eye on that and wondering how he can cancel the midterms, I'm sure. And the other story that emerged, of course, in talking about journalists, is two very high-profile journalists in the United States have been arrested for trying to cover the protests in Minnesota. What's going on in America at the moment is not short of fascism, absolutely. So, as I say, if the Americans are trying to preach to anyone at the moment about human rights, then they're on pretty shaky ground. The other big news this week from the States, of course, has been the Epstein files. In fact, before we get into them, can I just recommend to people they watch a Netflix movie? Little bit bubblegum, but frightening in the same note, by the same token. It's called The Anniversary, and it's about America being taken over by an autocratic organization. Well worth a watch if you are into that sort of thing. So,
And
yes,
Civil War, that's another one.
like Civil War's what, yeah, but this one, Joe, is. So I thought Civil War was a little bit flight of fancy at times. This is really shows you how people can fall for this sort of right-wing populist rhetoric and ends up in a very, very dark place. Worth a watch, as I say. You always get good film reviews on here these days, don't you, as well as the politics. Jim, the Epstein files.
On that front, as we're being...
go on, we've got to... Here we go.
Saipan, the most badly titled film, you know, to try and get people to watch. I watched it on my own in a cinema last Thursday. It's about the clash between Mick McCarthy, the manager of Ireland, and and Keane, Roy Keane. You know, and it's one.
In it, isn't it?
Yeah, Steve Coogan plays Mick McCarthy, and you as a football, anyone who loves football politics will really enjoy it. But the trouble is, it's gone out of the cinemas already because Saipan, I mean, it's just, you know, that's happened to be where the Irish team went for training before they went on to Japan. I thought it was a war film to begin with because it was a site of a terrible battle between the Americans and the Japanese in the Second World War. You know, it should have had Roy Keane's name in it, but it's a great watch. As this, you know, he gets there and sees this awful football pitch with a donkey on it and all this sort of stuff, and you can just see this simmer. And he was offered cheese sandwiches for breakfast, you know, and it's this simmering, rising anger, and the eventual confrontation between Roy and Mick McCarthy it's a great film, but you'll struggle to find it because it's gone almost immediately. So I'm terribly sorry. What a diversion!
It'll be on Netflix shortly. It'll be on. It'll be on the telly. So people. So what's it called again?
Saipan, which is at the island there where they were training, but it has no relevance to the.
Sounds
Roy
like
Keane.
a bloody Chinese restaurant. Anyway,
well, exactly. Yeah.
Let's move on. Let's move on.
I'm more worried about Jim sitting on his own in the cinema in the daytime. You know, did you have your Mac on?
It's crazy.
Oh, you see, Joe, I thought that, but I thought, no, best not say.
First thing that occurred to me.
Luckily, he said he thought it was a war film. At one point, I thought he'd said a porn film. Anyway, let's move quickly on to the Epstein files. And,
nice link there, Frank.
No, sadly. They've been a long time coming. And what strikes me, first and foremost, let's say, you know, the Department of Justice have once again let down the victims of Epstein and his cohort by saying no further charges are going to be brought, despite the release of literally millions of documents and files. And then the other thing that I don't know whether this is because of the British media coverage, but I've been on CNN and there doesn't appear to be an awful lot about Americans being caught up with Epstein. Let's remember the vast majority of people who were mates and flying over to that island were Yanks. A lot of the tech bros were involved with him. Trump undoubtedly had some involvement with him, but that appears to be getting covered up. But every time there's a Brit mentioned, it's headline news. Now, on a serious point, once again, Peter Mandelson is most seriously being caught up in allegations, let's say at this point, that do not look good for the former government minister. In fact, I would go as far as to say he needs to be considered his position as a peer, never mind his position as a member of the Labour Party. Jim, what have you made of it all?
Yeah, obviously, you and I have encountered Peter Mandelson in our careers, and I enjoyed his company and that sort of thing. But it's reached a point now. There's this talk about having an act of parliament to remove him from the House of Lords. As far as I know, Peter Mandelson could use the power of retirement from the House of Lords. He's done the right thing, in inverted commas, in regard to his Labour Party membership last night. He needs to do the right thing now and retire from the House of Lords and spare Sir Keir Starmer any more embarrassment, because the wider issue is, as Peter Mandelson disappears with inevitably a massive stain on his career in British politics, which has been quite remarkable in good ways and bad ways. One of the founders of New Labour, but a man who's 3 times had to leave high office for lack of judgment, let's put it kindly. I mean, the other thing is, it just stretches credibility. He's saying that I'm not sure the documents have got misspellings on them and I can't recall receiving this money. I mean, we're talking about thousands of pounds. Are we seriously asked to believe that he can't recall receiving this money? It just stretches credibility. But the more serious point is, I'm afraid, Sir Keir Starmer's judgment. Maybe all this wasn't known, but if there's an element of worry about it, why appoint him as American ambassador? And the last thing is that one of the big problems we've got with politics now is that that old thing which I always used to get very irritated about, is that they're all the same. The idea that Labour came into office and it would be the end of the sort of sleaze and the circus. The trouble for the government is that the Epstein thing is continuing to fuel this damage to the Labour government, that it's the same old thing. It's scandal. It's the circus, who's in, who's out, who's going to be leader of the party. And that's one of the things I think is really damaging the government.
And Mandelson has always had this tendency, Joe, as he's like a bloody magpie, looking for the next shiny thing. And I know it was a concern that people around him, including Tony Blair, always had. He is attracted to celebrities, attracted to cash. And as Jim said, it is beyond belief, really, that you can't recall receiving a payment of 75 grand. Come on. Peter Mandelson, okay, he's wealthy in the terms that people out in the country would think, but he's not wealthy to the point where 75,000 quid is treated as just a chunk of change. So that doesn't bear any sort of scrutiny. And then obviously his husband is caught up as well, taking loans from this bloody scumbag. It's, as Jim says, just does not do credit to Peter Mandelson, who, as Jim again has said, we both met, like the man, great company, good minister, particularly when he was at the Department of Trade. But this has scandalised both him and indirectly the Prime Minister as well.
Well, absolutely. And I think, we can all go back to the loan that he got to buy the house in Notting Hill, which was the beginning of all of that, which was his first resignation. And it comes back to this thing about the lack of curiosity of people around you who go, gosh, that's interesting. All of a sudden, Jim isn't sitting on his own in a cinema on a wet Wednesday. He's sitting in a baronial hall. wonder where he got the money from. And I think I'm afraid that it does reflect very badly on Keir Starmer and the people around him, because there must have been somebody going, this is too risky, with Trump in the White House particularly, and all the bubbling of the Epstein stuff, then actually it was a damn foolish move. And at the moment, we haven't got an ambassador. I think he's going over there, the acting ambassador, or he's taking over sometime this month. But, it does reflect badly on Keir Starmer's judgment. And I think, I completely agree with you, Frank. Whilst it is, fantastic fodder for the Mail and all the other outlets of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and Fergie, who just looks more and more desperate and vulgar, as one of the Queen's equerries once said about her. All of that is fine, and we love the downfall of people like that. But actually, the real nuts and bolts of this Epstein stuff are the tech bros. It's the Peter Thiels, it's the Bill Gates, it's the Noam Chomsky, for goodness sake, highly respected academic and writer. It's Trump, it's Musk. We need to know more about them rather than concentrate on the flim-flam of a disgraced ex-prince and a now even more disgraced ex-peer.
I wonder, Jim, whether it has an impact. We've talked about the potential impact on politics and the Labour Party and the Prime Minister, and they're all the same, is the phrase that is often used, of course, against politicians. But the royal family, again, Charlie will have his head in his hands, won't he, over these latest revelations?
Yes, I mean, that new photograph, I mean, we had the pretty questionable photograph of Andrew with his arm around Mr. Frey, but this one where he's actually sort of lying over a prone body is just beyond anything. And he must have known that this photograph existed, when he gave his interview to Emily Maitlis, and when he's done all this slow move and he's still not left the lodge and all this sort of stuff. So, I mean, as we know now, we all loved the late Queen, but if she had a weak point, it was her devotion to Andrew. He was her favourite, and I think that helped to prop him up and gave him a sort of sense of immunity, which has served him very badly. I mean, just you are right to say that there's a tremendous emphasis in the American press about Andrew and Mandelson, and not so much about the Americans. I did hear because we're all wondering whether there is a smoking gun for Trump, and it was suggested to me that if there was, Joe Biden would have released these documents. I don't know what we make of that. And the last thing to say is, apparently, even though it's now 50 days since they had to comply with the law and release all the documents, they haven't released all the documents. But how many damn documents are there? We're into the millions. I mean, the documentation of this has been incredible. But I just wonder whether you think, that Biden would have released it, or is there potential collateral damage to other Democrats as a reason why he didn't?
I think there's. I think this is great news management by Trump and his cronies, because of the way in which they're leaking this stuff out and creating headlines about other big names. And obviously, there's few bigger than Andrew. And then, of course, you've got Mandelson. You've also had Richard Branson implicated to a lesser extent this week. They were all emailing this guy as though he was a good bloke, and clearly it was just the cash, wasn't it? And hopefully it wasn't some of the other things that he was up to, as far as Richard Branson was concerned, at least. My view with Biden and most of what I would describe as the establishment of American politics was this was a story best left alone, because there would be so many people implicated. Now, that's no consolation to the victims, but I don't think that having Biden not release these documents suggests, to me at least, that Trump isn't implicated. In fact, what I'm being told is the DOJ have struck out and not published some of the references that have been made to Trump in the latest batch of documents. So we'll have to see. But equally, my instinct tells me that there ain't going to be a smoking gun as far as this is concerned with Trump. What they have done, though, is irritated and aggravated much of their own base in the way that they've handled this situation, and therefore there has been a fracturing of MAGA, and Marjorie Taylor Greene being the highest profile Republican who sort of walked away from Trump, but there's many others as well. So it's not done them any favours, but it certainly wouldn't be something that's going to bring him down. Just one final point on this, Jim. I just want to stick with the Andrew and Fergie revelations. Do you think that this could seriously further damage the reputation of the royal family? Because King Charles, we would say he's done a good job, but he's not held with the same affection as the late Queen. And you do get the impression that Prince William, if he was given the option, would walk away from it all tomorrow. So is the monarchy in this country under a little bit of threat, do you think? Oh.
Well, we've lost Jim. He's gone back to that cinema in the sky somewhere. But whilst Jim comes back, I think that's an interesting point. I think people are more affectionate to Charles, actually. Okay. And obviously not that like they were for the Queen, because there was a whole thing during the Second World War when she was a little girl, and all of those sort of things, and she was around for ever and ever and ever. But I think there is an affection and a warmth towards Charles, that he is much more relaxed, he's much more open. His battle with cancer, his willingness to talk to people and not be standoffish, I think has helped a lot. And I think, Camilla has done a lot to help that. I mean, there will still be pockets of, the Diana conspiracy theorists, but actually, they seem to be much more normal and much more relaxed. I think it's what comes next. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. If the Queen had come down hard on Andrew years and years ago when all of this first surfaced, it wouldn't be so awful. But actually, Charles did the right thing. He stripped him of his title. He's got him out of that swanky home and put him into another swanky home. Who cares what happens to Sarah Ferguson? She's nothing but a grifter. But I think, for William, who has also got to contend with his brother and his ridiculous goings on, the other side of the Atlantic, it's probably not a happy place to be, to think, well, can we just muddle through with me and Kate and Sophie and Edward and a few, odds and sods? Because the other people, of course, who are affected by this are Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, the children of Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, who I'm sure will not want to be in the public light because it's just so embarrassing.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm sorry, I just hit the wrong button. I think you possibly have made the points. I think William, this is why William has been even more fierce than his father in wanting to downgrade Prince Andrew. I think he strengthened his father's will to actually strip the titles away, and because he realizes what you're hinting at, that this is an existential threat to the monarchy potentially. And the other thing is that I think William's vision for the monarchy is, as Joe says, a much more slimmed down version of it, so that you haven't got this large number of people who are prone to the human foibles and can damage the image. I think he wants a different sort of monarchy, very much involved with the people caring, but slimmed down. A lot of the pomp and ceremony, I think, will go under William. And he will, whether he wanted to walk away from it or not, I mean, that's the cruelty of this, in some ways, absurd hereditary monarchy, that people are born and have no choice about it. And my wife says it's cruelty in some ways, that people, I mean, look at George VI. He was frightened to death of coming to the throne with his speech impediment. In a sense, there's a sense of, it is a sense of cruelty being played out. But I think, the big question you ask about whether this country would easily become a republic, I think not. Despite these things, I think the idea of a sort of bland president doesn't appeal to people because of the general feeling about politicians, because if you had a president, it would be some some aging politician or somebody like that. It's unlikely to be a man of the people like yourself, Frank, who become president of the United Kingdom, although a wonderful choice. So I don't think the institution is doomed, but I think these things do not help, and I think William is very, very focused on what comes next.
The single parents right across the Northwest who have got their violins out about the cruelty that those poor buggers in the royal family have to go through as they go and draw their family credit and get abused by Tory backbench MPs for doing so. And also, of course, being told that they can't have any more kids unless they want the benefits capped. But there you go. Cruelty comes in all shapes and forms, doesn't it, James? And it's funny where people's sympathies lie at times. But anyway, we're going to take a very short break once again. When we come back, I'm going to be telling you about a parliamentary lunch that Downtown in Business hosted earlier this week. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the final part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. Just a brief update, really, on our campaign that is trying to unlock the UK's hospitality and visitor economy. It's an area, an industry that is suffering and challenged. It's a broad industry, of course, because it takes in everything, doesn't it? From football to museums to pubs to restaurants to hotels. So it's often difficult to get a campaign up and running because you are dealing with such a wide range of issues and a wide range of people. But nevertheless, alongside our good friends at the Liverpool Big Company, Downtown in Business has established a campaign plus a charter of things that we think government and parties of all colours should be looking at in terms of being able to support the industry sector across the board. And if you go into the show notes, you will see a link to that charter on our website. So we descended upon Parliament this week on Thursday. There was myself, Bill Addy from the Liverpool Big Company, alongside his colleague Katie Bentley, and then a smattering of industry leaders from across the country. We had Birmingham, Newcastle, Manchester, Leeds, all represented. And then we had parliamentarians join us. Most relevant and I have to say most impressive was Chris Webb, the Blackpool South MP, who's also the chair of the Tourism and Hospitality All-Party Parliamentary Group. And I have to say, Chris spoke extremely well and definitely had his finger on the pulse of the issues that hospitality venues are facing at the moment. There's two things I sort of say that are of immediate concern to the sector. One, of course, is the business rates, which are being reviewed, and some people's business rates have been increased to the point where it will lead to a flurry of venue closures if those changes go ahead in April, May. We had somebody sat with us talking about their business rates going up by 106%, which just seems absolutely illogical. And Faye Dyer at the arena in Liverpool was telling us that her rate bill is about to increase by £500,000. And these are eye-watering sums that simply can't be covered by tuppence on a ticket price. So I'm not sure who Rachel Reeves is talking to, listening to. I know she's made some concessions for pubs, but pubs are not the only problem here. Hotels, bars, restaurants, the wider visitor economy are all going to struggle. And if we are serious about reviving our high streets and getting some economic growth into our system, then we must address what is now a crisis in hospitality. Our little jaunt to London this week hopefully has nudged some of our parliamentarians into the right direction, and conversations, of course, are continuing. I don't know whether this is an issue that you've picked up at all, Joe. I'm sure it is in your part of the world.
Yeah, it's an absolute disaster for all the reasons you've said. And you know, it's a real struggle, and it has been for a long time for pubs to keep going. Many of them have diversified into food, you know, but it's the cost of staffing. And it, you know, again, it goes back to, does the government actually listen to real people? Because it's impossible to put that level of increase into a sector, and also, you know, 15%, oh yeah, well, that's, you know, it's not worth anything, frankly. And if you're going to do it to pubs, why aren't you doing it to restaurants? Why aren't you doing it to hotels? You know, the hospitality sector is really, really important, in terms of, you know, the supply chain and jobs, particularly in rural or less urban areas. I mean, there's a bloke who has got a pub around here near me, and he, you know, he reckons he employs indirectly or directly 200 people, and he gets, you know, bread from the local bakers and meat from the local butchers and fish from the fishmonger, all of those things. If you take that away, you don't only decimate high streets, you decimate small communities who need those businesses to keep going. And it's actually, we were talking at the beginning of the programme about our lack of manufacturing. We're actually really good at this stuff. We're really good at running good pubs. We're really good at arts and culture and music and all of those sort of things. And we're really good at being inventive and working out how to survive, whether that's turning the pub into, you know, a shop as well, or doing special things for dog walkers, or having library groups, or all of those sorts of things. And all of the people who are doing these are entrepreneurs, and they're trying to make a go of it. It's not just about getting rich. You know, Tom Kerridge, the well-known chef, was talking the other day. He's got 4 pubs. Only one of them breaks even. You know, why does he keep doing it? Because he loves it. And yet the government is killing this very sort of entrepreneurial activity, and they've done it over and over and over again. And we keep talking about the high streets, and it's where people go out every day and their hearts sink, particularly at this time of year, when they think what it used to be like, and then they think, and the government's going to kill another one. It's
I
just
do
beyond
think
belief.
that, yeah, I do think this is an extension, you know, an extension of the poor policy making and that lack of ability to listen to real people and genuine concerns, Jim. I've been saying to people for a long time now, it seems, I don't think this government is anti-business, but I don't think it understands business. And I think the decision that she took to say, oh, okay, let's look at pubs and not think, what about the hotels? What about the bars?
Yeah.
What about the restaurants? And an interesting point was made by one of the operators on Thursday afternoon in Parliament, when they said, you do know that when they reduced VAT for the hospitality sector during COVID and lockdowns and all that in and out that we had during that period of time, the Treasury tax take actually went up. And of course, what I've never really considered as far as the VAT arguments is concerned is that they pay VAT, they charge VAT on food, but of course they can't claim that back. And so it does make a huge impact on the sector. And the other thing that Joe sort of alluded to there is it's not like a widgets business, is it? Where you can store a load of stuff, and if you have a month where you don't sell as much as you thought you would, you projected to, doesn't much matter because you can increase your sales the following month. What we're talking here, of course, is perishable goods. So you end up either going into restaurants these days where they do often now come over to you and say, well, we haven't got this, and this on the menu, I'm afraid, sir, because they just cannot afford to take those risks anymore. And of course, the other crisis, partly at least caused by Brexit, recruitment. And again, very, very difficult now for the hospitality sector because of the increases that the Chancellor has put on the minimum wage for younger people. And so again, restaurateurs, hotels and others are saying, well, why would I pay a young person that amount of cash when I can get someone more experienced in to do that? And anyway, I can't afford to pay people that amount of money because my margins are just not good enough. Jim, it's a ridiculous situation that she's getting herself into because you, I'm sure, like me, can see decimated high streets, 3 or 4 months of bad headlines, and she stands up in the Commons, puts together a budget and says, I'm going to reverse that now. By which time it'll be too bloody late.
Yeah, well, of course, that was I mean, everything isn't down to presentation, but it was absolutely disastrous that on the day that she announced some relief for pubs in her budget, the same day this massive business rates revaluation came in. Where's the coordination? I mean, how could the government be blindsided by that? So that set the whole thing off on a bad foot to begin with. But there's also, as you say, where's the Treasury modelling, which shows that the minimum wage, national insurance, the new alcohol tax that came in yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, and the next one's sort of slightly out of their control, but Sky Sports subscriptions, they put football and rugby on in pubs, that's going up. So there's a perfect storm on this, as Joe says, and going back to our early discussion, and take the point about manufacturing, and I'm sort of nostalgic for that. It's not going to come back, but hospitality potentially is very, very important. The only thing I would say is, that, and this goes back to the fundamental mistake right at the beginning, is that Rachel Reeves is permanently scrabbling around for taxes to try and keep the show on the road. So it's an obvious defence thing to put up. But the campaign by Downtown is absolutely excellent. But the only pushback has to be, I've got the students on my back about student loans. That's a rising debate. I've got the publicans and the arena owners and on my back. All they ever want is relief from taxes, and no one's telling me where I'm going to get the money to keep the show on the road. So that's my observation about it, trying to be balanced about it in Rachel's favour.
But I think the point you actually made yourself, Jim, where is the modelling? Because it seems to me that Rachel is being driven by spreadsheets, because she keeps coming up with this comment, the average increases only. Well, it's not about the average increase, I'm afraid. It's about the £500,000 increase to the arena in Liverpool, or it's about the 106% increase for that poor restaurateur from Leeds. Those are the problems that she's simply not taking account of, and she's not listening to those concerns, which are genuine. These people aren't trying to kid her along. They will close if those changes go ahead. And I simply say to her, and it's always this argument about tax, and it's where I do have, I'm afraid, some sympathy with the Conservative Party when they're managing the economy. There is absolutely a case to say that if you try and tax people too much, then your tax take will go down. And the Exchequer know this from experience. So the idea that these changes are going to bring more money into the coffers, go back to that comment the guy made around the table on Thursday in Parliament. When VAT went down during the COVID crisis, the Treasury's tax take went up. And Tony Blair always used to say, if you go beyond 40% in Tony's view, in terms of tax, people will find ways of not paying it, and you'll end up struggling in terms of your Treasury tax take. And that's proved to be the case. So I think it's wrong-headed. It's wrong for all sorts of reasons in terms of just the way it will impact on our high streets and our communities. But ultimately, if you are serious about growing your economy, having vibrant high streets in your towns and your cities, then this sector needs to be supported. I would urge the government to take a very, very urgent look at the issues that the hospitality sector is facing. If you want to get involved in our campaign, please visit our website again in the show notes, and we will tell you how, or attend our conference that we're hosting in Manchester, which is focused on the hospitality and visitor economy. That's happening on the 28th of February. Again, details are in the show notes. So that's all we've got time for this week, I'm afraid. Hope you've enjoyed.
I think it's the 26th of February, Frank.
26th of February.
I think 28th is Saturday. I don't think it'll be on here.
It is. It's the 26th. You're quite right. It's the 26th of February.
The day of the by-election.
And hey, isn't that good? Hey, well, what an exciting day to look forward to.
Yeah.
All happening in Manchester as well, of course. Right. That brings us to the end of another week in the Downtown Den Politics podcast. It was good to have Jim in vision again this week. So nice to see you again, Jim. Always lovely to see you as ever, Joe. And let's hope for better things for your football teams next weekend. Have a great week, everyone. Thanks for listening.